Good morning, everyone. My name is Dorothy Noyes. I'm the director of the Mershon Center for International Security Studies here at Ohio State. I want to welcome our visitors and our local audience and to wish Ramadan Mubarak to those of us who are celebrating it this month. The Mershon Center studies the interactions of international, national, and human security. And sadly, there is no better case study for those interactions than the Iraq War, where an intervention in the name of national security was enormously, complexly, and durably consequential, both for international order and for human life at every scale of analysis. Back in 2010, which feels like both 100 years ago and yesterday, I organized a Mershon Center conference on making sense in Afghanistan. And that brought together perspectives of ordinary Afghans, occupying forces, military planners, political actors, and theorists to interpret a chaotic picture and imagine paths forward. Afghanistan has remained a source of collective Western anxiety, if not necessarily a productive learning. But for more ordinary Americans, on the contrary, the project of making sense of Iraq seems perhaps to have been set aside by many. So Mershon was extremely fortunate to have Zaynab Quadri join us this year as a postdoc. Dr. Quadri's research on the material and cultural consequences of private military contracting in the Iraq and Afghan wars has been exciting, much-deserved attention of its own. But in addition, Dr. Quadri has been eager to prompt broader reflection among her students and colleagues. And it is she who conceived of this conference, came up with the list of participants, and designed the framework. So we owe her a real debt of gratitude for guiding us towards a deeper conversation than the commentary it is currently providing. So I will now turn it over to her. Please welcome Zaynab Quadri, and welcome to you.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to, I wanted to thank our staff first for everything that they've done to put this event together. Our director, Dorothy Noyes, thank you so much for your welcoming remarks. Our team with Terry Murphy, with Danny Wallerman, with Kyle McCrae, Andy Mackey. They have all done above and beyond work to put everything together for us today. And I also wanted to thank our facilitators, Chris Nichols and Lydia Walker, for agreeing to help us put on these really important conversations. And again, my audience in Zoom and in person, thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope that it will be an exciting day, even though it is currently raining here in Columbus, and we are talking about war. But in terms of thinking about 20 years, 20 years since the Iraq War began. It's a difficult amount of time to wrap one's head around in the increasingly fast-paced, internet-centric world of the 21st century. Historians would not yet consider the Iraq War history, given the famous 30-year rule. But for the students I teach, especially in my current course on U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East, anything before the 2016 election feels like ancient history, despite the unprecedented digital availability of information. My students are too young to remember for September 11th firsthand. In fact, anyone born on the day of the invasion in March 2003 is now old enough to join ROTC and enlist in the military. My students repeatedly tell me that they take courses like mine because they want to understand, quote unquote, what really happened in Iraq. And they deserve a comprehensive, thoughtful answer, with the benefit now of hindsight. Historians may quibble about what counts as history, but I have to teach the Iraq War the same way that I teach the 1970s, the 1940s, the 1910s, as a past, with primary sources and a historiography, in a broader context of American power. 20 years is in some ways no time at all, but 20 years is already, in other ways, a generation ago. Therefore, I organized this event to bring us together, not in shock and awe, but in sobriety and reflection. Unlike my students, I am old enough to remember September 11th personally, albeit distantly. My coming of age as a Muslim woman, an Americanized child of Pakistani immigrants, is inextricable from the events we will be discussing today. Professionally, however, I came to the Iraq War in graduate school when I decided to write my dissertation, and now book in progress, on the subject of private military contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan. As a historian and a scholar of American studies, working on the intersections of American politics, culture, and diplomacy, I believe there is much more important work to be done in grappling with, quote unquote, what really happened in Iraq. This conference event is meant to provide an opportunity to do just that, to consider seriously the myriad local and global consequences of American foreign policy. We are therefore incredibly fortunate to be joined today by a true dream team of scholars across fields and disciplines to have what I hope will be a genuine conversation around these important issues. Rather than asking our panelists to present full individual papers, we have pre-circulated questions and preliminary thoughts amongst ourselves so that we may build off of each other's insights in a more spontaneous and free-flowing way. We hope that our audience, both in person and on Zoom, will join in this conversation with thoughtful questions that will help us to generate not only insights, but further questions and opportunities for reflection. Throughout the course of the day, you will be hearing from our panelists on three broad topics. First, we will consider the social and political costs of intervention on Americans, but especially on Iraqis. Second, we will discuss broader historical contexts in which to situate the 2003 invasion and what followed. And finally, in the afternoon, we will examine news media and cultural narratives around the Iraq War, what we might call the first draft of history as it unfolded in real time. Please join me in once again welcoming our incredible panelists to OSU, and I look forward to seeing how the day develops. Thank you so much. I guess we'll just jump right into the first panel, which I'm also facilitating. So I wanted to briefly introduce our first panel of speakers. Zaynab Saleh is an associate professor and chair of anthropology at Haverford College. She is interested in questions of empire and colonialism, belonging and subjectivity, migration and diaspora, and violence and knowledge production. Her first book, Return to Ruin, Iraqi Narratives of Exile and Nostalgia, published in 2021, began as an inquiry into the transformation of the Iraqi political landscape, both in Iraq and the diaspora, and the reconfiguration of understandings of selfhood among Iraqis in London in light of the US invasion. And we also have Bridget Guarasci, an associate professor of anthropology at Franklin and Marshall College. She's an environmental anthropologist whose work examines the intersections of war and ecological life in the Arab majority world. Her book manuscript, Ecology of War, Iraq's Marshes on the Battlegrounds of War, considers how the management of nature during the US occupation and UN reconstruction of Iraq was particularly vicious warfare because of the way marshlands conservationists targeted not just life form, but the life systems it depends on. And we also have Catherine Lutz, a cultural anthropologist and co-director of Costs of War at Brown University. She is the Thomas J. Watson Jr. Family Professor Emerita of Anthropology and International Studies, and is the author of a number of widely read books, including Homefront, A Military City and the American 20th Century, Unnatural Emotions, Reading National Geographic, Carjacked, and Schooled. She is also the editor of War and Health and the Empire of Bases, and has consulted with the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations on sexual exploitation and abuse among peacekeepers, and with the government of Guam on the US military's environmental and social impact. She is past president of the American Ethnological Society and has been a Guggenheim Fellow and a Radcliffe Fellow. She co-founded and directs the Costs of War Project at Brown's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. So with that, I will go ahead and get the ball rolling with a first question, I think almost the obvious question, and we will take just a couple of minutes to have each panelist give a preliminary answer, and we'll see kind of how things develop from there. But the first question is just, how can we make sense of the costs of war for the United States in going to Iraq? So if you want to each take a couple of minutes, we can maybe start on the end and work our way in.
So actually, like, I think Kathy will be a great person to answer this question. But like, I'll give just like my few thoughts about that, like based on the cost of war, and also a recent article that Mustafa Bayoumi published. So I guess like in terms of the impact of the invasion on the United States, we really like need to look at like how the lies that were prevalent at the time and promoted by the media, mainstream media and corporate media, really paved the way for Trump's moment. And I think this is Mustafa Bayoumi's article in The Guardian. So this is not my thought, this is Mustafa's thought. So I think this is really kind of was the beginning where like outspoken lies, like were kind of people got away with lies, and they managed to wage a war and then got away with it. Because like really one of the interesting things for me as an Iraqi following the 20th anniversary is like how really still mainstream media and corporate media didn't try to hold Bush, Cheney, Blair, Rumsfeld accountable for the war. So, and of course this is like really ironic because that the Russian war in Ukraine is happening, and now the ICC has accused Putin of war crimes. So this is like one issue in terms of the war, the question of facts and truth. The other question that the other point that I'm just going to touch upon and then leave maybe for Kathy to elaborate on is like really the arms companies were the ones who benefited the most from the war. So that was like for them the war was a success in this regard. The last point I want to make is really the impact of the war on vets, on U.S. vets who served in Iraq. And it's like the three of us, Kathy, Bridget, and I were in a conference 3 weeks ago about organized by Columbus State University and the National Infantry Museum. And there were some vets involved in the event. And what was really interesting listening to them is like some of them are really regretful and like thought that they became pawns in a war like they had no stake in, and they were the ones who were left with physical and mental energies. They were the ones who like didn't find jobs when they came back. So like they are the ones who really paid for it. But the other thing that they really mentioned, which was interesting for me, is like the resentment they felt towards civilian Americans because they really had no idea about what it was like to serve in Iraq or Afghanistan. So there was like, they always talked about, at that conference, they always talked about the civilian-military divide and how they felt that the majority of Americans really don't understand what the soldiers and the vets went through.
Yeah, thanks for that, Zaynab. So thanks so much for having us, Zaynab. Thanks for organizing. Thanks to all of you for being here. So I'm gonna take this question and turn it around a little bit, which is what academics always do. So please accept my apologies for this reinterpretation. But there's just no making sense of the Iraq War. I refuse to make sense of it. It was an illegal war based on lies, and I don't feel that my job as a scholar is to try to help us understand the thinking that led us to this war. I hope we never are in this position again. So, you know, and as Zainab already rightfully cited Mustafa Bayoumi's article, I really do think it ushered in the era that we're living in now. I teach at a liberal arts college, and one of the things that I hear from my students who take my Anthropology of the Middle East course is we're here because we have grown up in the shadow of 9/11. Literally every element of our lives is saturated by social media. So we know that we have been enculturated into an anti-Arab terror mentality, but we don't know what we don't know. We don't even know how to think about what it is we don't know because there's so saturated with this post-truth era that they know they don't know, but they need a basis to begin understanding how to think about and make sense of the world that they're in. So if there's any making sense, I see my job as a faculty member to help my students learn how to think differently. This enculturation that they have been participating in is extensive to the point where in America today, nobody cares about Iraq. Nobody cares. It is the background noise to the, whatever the sort of Twitterverse is, a buzz with lately. So one way I've tried to understand the Iraq War is by looking at the organization of the war and its effects, particularly through a focus on the environment, and specifically in Iraq's southern marshes, where a biodiversity conservation initiative of these wetlands actually led to their near ecological collapse today. And I'll talk more about that today.
Well, and thanks so much for setting this up and for giving us these questions ahead of time, because there are so many different elements of an answer to this question, this first question, that I'm glad you gave me the chance to bullet point 105 of them, and I'll only go through the first 20.
This question is mostly for you.
But I think it's true that the first cost is truth, right? That this was, and your description, Bridget, of your students and their struggles, I don't know if epistemological fog is the right word for it, but this idea of young people and older people just not knowing where to go to really get a grip hold on what really happened, and whether they continue to struggle or feel defeated is a super important question. But I think that, and again, this conference that we were just at, there was a lot of discussion about, by one of the keynoters, a high-ranking Army officer who'd been in the war, who talked about how successful they'd been at controlling the narrative.
Yeah.
And in particular, he said, we did not have the roof of the embassy moment, right? Ironically, I had actually looked for that roof of the embassy moment, which I remembered seeing a photograph of Leon Panetta in his flak jacket and helmet, as he was, furling up the flag back in 2010 or 2011. And it has been disappeared off the internet. It was a Department of Defense picture, I'm sure, and they succeeded in disappearing it. But anyway, so the question is the war, the search for truth, is in a context where very powerful, well-funded public relations campaigns by the U.S. military have resulted in either an invisible or an imaginary war, right? That's what people are being served, and many, many people have accepted, right? I think, so that's one thing. The next thing is a kind of moral coarsening, which I don't think we paid enough attention to, the idea that war is, like slavery, a human institution that destroys bodies and destroys the souls of the people who wage that violence. Right? So I think, that the moral coarsening, which has many different shapes and forms, including racism, Islamophobia, I think we have to see that as you can't have a society having spent 20 years doing that violence, doing that massive scale of violence, not having a damaged soul, right? A set of damaged souls. And I think, in addition, an acceleration of these are not new problems, right? Racism, Islamophobia, and so on. But the acceleration, the gasoline being thrown on those things is important. And then the toxic masculinity, the sort of violent masculinities that have been celebrated through the last 20 years at an even higher rate, again, resulting in this sort of Trumpist ethos of violence is really important to see. Historians have talked forever about the imperial presidency, the rise of acceleration of the concentration of power in our executive branch, and that continues apace as allowing for, again, the acceptance of authoritarianism in combination with these other ways in which that our society has been reshaped. A fourth thing is the rise in the size, power, monopolization, and profit-taking of the U.S. military-industrial corporations, and a corresponding acceleration in a more general corporate capture of Congress, right? These corporations have become so much larger, so much more concentrated in their ability and successful in their ability to capture resources from the federal discretionary budget. I think that's, again, under-recognized. The growth of military spending as a proportion of the overall discretionary budget. You can watch the, we haven't done this yet, but I think we have to create an infographic that shows you how, if you take the pie chart of the federal discretionary budget each year, that the part that is the Pentagon, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons program, and the interest on the debt based on borrowing for this and previous wars. If you take all of that spending, which is very strictly speaking military spending, and you watch it slowly devour and collapse the spending on every other element of public need and public welfare. So that has happened because not just as a result of war spending, but as a result of the rise in what's called the base budget at a very rapid clip. And again, it hasn't stopped, right? This year, it's worse than last year, which is worse than the year before. So the end of the war has not ended the war or the militarism that requires this massive spending. And then there's other economic effects that some of the wonderful contributors to the Cost of War project, which include Bridget and Zaynab, have been to understand how the sort of macroeconomic effects of that kind of spending, which is on the various ways the military spends money. They all have macroeconomic effects on things like interest rates, on job opportunities, and job creation, and some of which we can talk about later. I think is super important for resisting militarism, is to counter a lot of the other kinds of narratives that are told about the impact of wars on economies. And then certainly impact at home on military families, the death and injuries, lifelong injuries. Again, many service members survive injuries that would have killed them during Vietnam, would have killed them during Korea, through advances in battlefield medicine and other things. So I think we have to look at this sort of generation of catastrophically injured veterans, and the disruptions that everybody knows about, because that's what the media has covered, is the struggles of military families with missing family members. But what they don't cover is the mental health issues, higher rates of domestic violence, higher rates of child abuse in those military families. And then finally, I think despite some support for the war and long-term, if unwarranted, faith in the U.S. military, it still ends up near the top of the list of American institutions that the citizenry have faith in. All the other ones, including the Supreme Court, Congress, the press, they're all much lower. Despite that, I think people do still have a sense that the war was lost by the U.S., that it was a defeat, and that there were catastrophic costs, and so cost and incompetence. I think people have a glimmer still, some access to information that suggests that something went wrong. But that loss of faith in that last institution of government, or the erosion of that, the collapse of the faith in the other arms of government, intertwined with this sort of violent masculinity and racism, I think has resulted in a further growth of paramilitarism, which Gibson argued years ago was one of the results of the Vietnam War, the loss in Vietnam. And I think have to be seen as contributing to the coup of 1/6, right? That these, and 20% of the people who've been charged in that insurrection were veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? That's not the proportion in the population, right? 20%. So I think that's just some of them, and I'm tired. No, I mean, I'm tired of how often that sounds like news to people who, we've been living with this for 20 years. We should all know this already. And it's a struggle to get anybody to pay attention.
I mean, the Cost of War Project has been such a help and an important repository for the people who are thinking about it. And as you both contributed, how have you seen the Cost of War Project kind of trying to fill that void of feeling like we've talked about this and yet we aren't talking about it at the same time? Anyone?
Yeah, it's interesting that kind of there is a will to ignorance that people don't want, especially like I think the media is really responsible in the United States to a great extent, that there is a reluctance to discuss these issues, and especially to focus really on the cost of war on Iraqis themselves. And I think really one of the things that people don't appreciate about the U.S. invasion, and I think this is where like Bridget's work is really amazing, is the environmental cost of the war. Like Iraq is going to be uninhabitable in 20 years because like environmentally like it's just decimated. So like when we are really talking about the cost of war, and like we are surprised like people don't know, it's just like when it comes to Iraqis, like really the war was like comprehensive, like it really impacted every single aspect of their lives in terms of the dismantlement of the state, the institution of neoliberal reforms, the collapse of infrastructure, the daily violence before like because of the U.S. military, now the militias, and of course we had Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and then like we have to think about displacement, like millions of Iraqis were displaced internally or abroad, the brain drain in the country, and the level of corruption is unfathomable. So like really when like Bridget and I and Haytham Bahura are co-editing a volume on Iraq, and we are calling it Iraq Unruled, because really the invasion kind of unleashed conditions of unruliness in the country at all levels, mental, social, political, environmental. So that's really one of the things like people are absolutely not aware of. And it's really like when we think about the war, like there is so much invisible violence, because we always think of like, okay, the casualties, how many Iraqis were killed, how many vets were injured. But like really kind of the environment is really a huge problem right now in Iraq in terms of drought, in terms of contamination. So really, it's really people do not. That's the problem. People do not know about that, and then the whole rhetoric about the war becomes like, how can we wage a better war next time? How can we learn from what happened? So I'll stop here because it's really I can go on and on about that, and I know I'm linking to the next question, but like that's really one of the issues. And I think like, there was also like the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War is coming up, and there was like an article with 4 Vietnamese writers, and like they are saying the same thing, like it's forgotten. The impact on Vietnamese people is like completely erased. So like that's the whole, but if you remember, then you can't wage a war. That's the whole thing. If you really remember, you wouldn't be able to wage a war.
Yeah, I would like to focus on the environment in my answer, but I'll just say quickly that, you know, I'm really grateful, of course, to Catherine and to the Cost of War Project for being able to generate a community of academics who can speak directly to public policy, to the media, and to creating a sort of a language of that exchange that is not academic jargon, but is just really straightforward. What's the brass tacks? What are the facts on the ground? So thank you for doing that. And I want to take us to, like, I think great journalism, and Rajiv, your book was so helpful to me, so thank you for writing it. Does this so effectively, and that's storytelling. I remember Anthony Shadid and his work fondly. So I was in the marshes in September 2022, so just this past September. And, we've already talked, thank you, Zainab, for bringing up the environmental effects of the war, because yes, this is absolutely one of those forms of wartime violence that's not often recognized as warfare. We're so focused on like bombings and military operations that we forget that for Iraq, the war is still ongoing. And that is because they're living through the devastating collapse of the environment. And so I was interested in exploring what I had been hearing through Twitter, through Instagram, through Facebook, which were the sort of constant reports of the Iraqi marshes nearing collapse. And so the sort of state of the marshes this fall were pretty dire. But all of southern Iraq, I'm thinking broadly here, not just in the marshlands proper, because they really are vast and cover a large swath of the southern part of the country. And that is because of oil flaring, which dramatically increased as a result of the U.S. occupation policies to convert Iraq's socialist command economy to a capitalist economy with minimal regulations for private industry. And I'd like to explore that in greater depth today, but I'll say first that flaring is a cheap way to get rid of methane that's produced from oil extraction and would otherwise be an explosive hazard. And when you do that, when you burn off the methane, you can release toxins into the air, and that's what's happening. Methane is a major contributor to climate change and rising temperatures. Iraq today is the 5th most vulnerable country in the world to climate change. This means that Iraq's climate is warming at twice the rate of the planet. This summer, it was over 50 degrees Celsius, that's 122 degrees Fahrenheit. It was so hot in Baghdad that when people opened the taps for a shower, they had to first empty the tap water into a bucket to let it cool, because otherwise it would be so hot to the skin that you couldn't feasibly take a shower. When you walk around and heat that, some of you may know this already, it feels like you're in an oven. It's like an animal on your face. The rising temperatures increase the salinity of waterways and foster algal blooms in the Gulf and that are creeping north into the Tigris and Euphrates. In 2018, for example, one algal bloom sent 118,000 people in Basra to the hospital. So salinity means that waters are unsafe to drink, and humans and buffalo are dying. And in the marshlands, people depend on buffalo for milk, for cheese. They're known for these dairy products, and so their economy is collapsing. Marshlands residents are leaving generational homes in droves, more than 2,000 documented by IOM in the last 2 years. So I'll conclude with this. I want to just tell a story about a night that I visited Nahran Omar, which has been in the news a lot lately. So maybe you guys have seen the coverage of this village. It's on the other side of the Hamar Marsh from the tourist destination Shabayish, which is also often talked about as like Eden remade. Mm-hmm. But in Nahran Omar, residents live within 2 kilometers of an oil field. From across the river, there are these massive plumes of fire jetting out into the sky. And I stood there in the village, and I could feel the hot from the fire on my face. I could, when I breathed, I smelled the acrid, sort of bitter sting of this toxicity in my nose. And my friend Hussein Al-Asadi is a filmmaker, and he turned to me and said, "Imagine what it is to breathe this every day." I thought about my daughter, who's 5 years old. Right now in the marshes, 70 to 100% of children living in the vicinity of oil flares have naphthalene in their blood. There's a pilot study that really brave scientists at the University of Basra did for BBC, Professor Hassan Shukri, And this is just the beginning of a broader study that he's embarking on now. But that means that these kids will likely develop childhood cancer. And indeed, nearly everyone I met or knew in Basra, in southern Iraq, in the marshes, had a child or knew a child about my daughter's age who is dying from cancer. By the end of this century and as early as 2050, Iraq is expected to be uninhabitable due to climate change. So my question is, how did the Fertile Crescent, so abundant with resources that it gave rise to human civilization, to systems of writing, state organization, arithmetic, and geometry, become a dystopian wasteland that cannot support life? And my argument is that the US engineered Iraq's environmental collapse.
Yeah, I'm really struck by this notion that the war didn't end for Iraqis, that we can still feel those impacts on civilians. And so that's kind of my second question that we've already started addressing, just how can we get our hands around what this has done to the people of Iraq? And how can we put it into words?
Yeah, and that's there was actually a celebration of that. Remember Donald Rumsfeld, creative chaos. We will go and dismantle everything, and people everything will this fairy tale, everything will fall into place. But it's really was interesting, the whole issue, in terms of thinking really about the war, especially at the last conference we were at, is really how do you wage a better war? It's not really about the impact on people, whether Iraqi, especially Iraqi civilians, and soldiers. So the whole issue is that how can we wage a better war next time? And it was really interesting, because the majority of the audience was military personnel, and they were oh yeah, we understand now the de-Baathification was wrong. We understand that the dismantlement of the army was wrong because people lost their jobs and then they joined the insurgency. So there was kind of this understanding, but the whole thing was how can we then do this better next time without these mistakes? And absolutely refusing to really engage with how the war changes the social, political, and environmental landscape. And I think because of technological advances, wars have been more lethal, not just for humans, but for the environment. And I think for the next panel, there will be a discussion about US intervention. And I don't want really to talk about that very much, but really Toby Jones argues that we should really look at the US intervention in Iraq as one period that extends 40 years, starting with the Iran-Iraq war and the 1991 war, the sanctions, which has been called an invisible war, and then the occupation. And what's really important is about the war and what happened is that the really invasion came on the heels of really devastating sanctions and war in 1991. And one of the things, I was born and raised in Iraq. I left in 1997, so I was there for the 1991 war. And this is really when we began to see the environmental degradation. So during the bombardment in 1991, when it began to rain, a black film would cover everything. The soil, the plants, the streets, and then a few months later, we would wake up and 3-4 trees in the garden are absolutely dry. Vegetables began to taste very bitter. Of course, cancer among people and children, especially in places where the bombardment was heavy in the south, began to increase. And a lot of people began to have weird allergies. And of course, what the 1990 war did was devastating the infrastructure of Iraq, followed by really debilitating sanctions. So that by the time the invasion happened in 2003, the social fabric in Iraq was collapsing. And then you had a devastating war that impacted all aspects of life, that led to kind of deregulation or creative chaos because something will happen. And of course, like it's Iraqis who are, the majority of Iraqis are paying a high price for that. And their stories are absolutely, and their daily lives are absolutely erased in the United States. Like it's just an abstract because like the really level of the tragedy or like the calamity is just unfathomable. It's really unfathomable. And like this is going to be like with us for generations because like this contamination is not just about this generation now, or like it's been with us like since the 90s. Like so this is like also, it's not just about the present, it's like really about a foreclosed future. And if you really talk to Iraqis, a lot of them talk about foreclosed future, like there is really no future to look forward to. Because of the existing conditions and the lack of any really effort to deal with these conditions, because the United States really institutionalized or instated a very corrupt ruling elite, sectarian ruling elite that has militias. So like if you, like there have been uprisings in Iraq, and especially like young generations are fed up with the situation, are trying to do something. And actually like the slogans they are raising is like, we want a homeland, or I'm coming down to take my rights. So they are really thinking in terms of homeland and rights. And like the assassination of activists, especially in the South, is so common and no one reports on it. No one talks about it. So like even if people are trying, even if Iraqi, so let's say like, yes, the Britain and the United States who were involved, like wash their hands and they don't want anything to do with it. But like even Iraqis who are living there and trying to do something like to resist, to change the status quo, are really like literally being killed. And so this is why like this whole notion of a foreclosed future is so dominant among Iraqis. But also the other thing, and I think I will like mention it very quickly and stop, is that you hear like more a call for repair and reparation and compensation among Iraqis. Like that was really one of the interesting things during the 20th anniversary commemoration among Iraqis, like Iraqi scholars or Iraqi civilians, is that there is now a call like for the United States and Britain to really pay reparations and do something about especially the environmental damage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point, Zainab. Like the foreclosed future is very real and present. I was just talking to my colleague Abdulrahman Ziad yesterday, and he's in Baghdad, very talented scholar of Iraq, is working a lot with think tanks now, is doing some reporting on the ground. And, you know, he was saying, I have to get out of here. I just can't be here anymore. Unemployment is so high that if you're, you know, a young and enterprising, basically your option is to create your own job, to try to patch together different contracts, and Zainab, your work directly touches on this, to be able to make a living. But this is no career. Like the possibility of having a career is you know, just an imaginary or a future that you know isn't secured. And I was saying, well, what's going on? You know, what's happening right now? And he said the currency problems are so extreme that, you know, we can't, I feel like the whole economy is going to come crashing down on us. And so maybe you guys have heard of the heist of the century of, you know, billions of dollars that went missing in the government. But these effects are really borne out by Iraqi citizens. And we don't think of them as tied to the war, and yet they are directly. So, you know, Bremer, by his own admission, the main priority that he had when he landed in Iraq was to completely remake Iraq's economy, to build a capitalist economy. And so Bremer's Order 39 concerns foreign investment. You know, we hear a lot about like Orders 1 and 2, but Order 39 and many of the other 100 orders dealt with the economy, but this one in particular deals with foreign investment. It liberalized trade, which basically means that it removed any limits on, or many, not, and I don't want to be extreme in my language here, but many limits on the operations of foreign private investment in Iraq. So, for example, with oil, this means that oil multinationals, and we can get into this more later if there's time, have no requirement to capture methane or to limit their pollution. They can essentially pollute with abandon in Iraq because of the ways in which the economy, the Bremer institutionalized a capitalist economy in Iraq. And second, the UN Security Council was in partnership with the U.S. occupation, and beginning with Resolution 1483, which put Iraq's biggest asset, its oil, into a public trust called the Development Fund for Iraq. I mean, the language here is like unbelievable. But that essentially meant that Iraq's greatest asset was going to be overseen by the IMF, the World Bank, and the Arab Fund for Social and Economic Development. And so then what happened? Oh my God. Like, permit me a minute to just draw this out for you. This really lives in the contracts. And Zaynab, I'd love to hear, I mean, please don't be silent on this. I'd love to hear from you about your own research. But the contracts for oil meant that, so there was an Iraqi, let me back up for a second. There was an Iraq hydrocarbons law that was drafted partly by the Western oil industry. Cheney met with ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and Halliburton, among others, in January 2003, to lock Iraq into private investment under the most corporate-friendly terms. And then President Bush attempted to tie this to benchmarks with the 2007 surge. So it didn't pass. But when it didn't pass, multinational corporations wrote it into oil contracts. And so in 2008, these oil contracts came up for bidding. Oil multinationals bypassed the Iraqi parliament, signing contracts that would provide the most favorable terms now for suddenly the availability of harnessing Iraq's oil to the multinational corporations. And the Bush administration was directly involved in helping to model these contracts. So the time horizon, which is 25 years, and scale, which includes like large quotas that the Iraqi government had to meet, are unprecedented. The contracts provide long-term, high ownership stakes and eliminate requirements that Iraq's oil should stay in Iraq. So companies there's no provision for companies to invest their earnings in the local economy or hire a majority of local workers. And as I've said, they include no provisions for methane recapture. So there are currently today 27 environmental laws on the books in Iraq, but the government has no ability, virtually, to implement them, to hold oil multinationals accountable. And Iraq is very dependent on oil, but the oil wealth that Iraq has doesn't stay in the country. 80% of its oil is exported, and the oil and gas sectors account for less than 2% of total employment. And so what is Iraq left with? In November 2001, another colleague of mine was in Nahran Omar, Mohammed al-Mubarak, and he was talking to residents, and one of them said, looking at the oil flares, this is our share of the oil. So for Iraq, what remains is toxic.
Yeah, Kathy, if you want to add anything to that, especially the deregulation, I think, is such an accountability issue.
No, I think your research, both of you, it's just been so crucial to our understanding, and including telling us about the work of Iraqi scholars who so few of us have access to their work, and knowing that hopefully some of this other work that you're talking about will be coming out in a way that's available to the world. But maybe I'll just mention a couple of things from, again, another very long bulleted list that I put together, but you've already spoken and much more embedded in recent research than I have. So what I wanted to just mention was the idea of indirect death, and that more general problem that if people see war in Hollywood terms in the United States, they understand the damages of war as battlefield damages, and mainly as damages to soldiers. But even so, we know that very, very conservatively, 500,000 Iraqi civilians died in the war. That's very, very conservatively, and there I think we have to mention I started to think of the loss of cultural archives, of social archives, of health archives in the country as a kind of someone shooting Iraq in the brain, in the archival brain, right? What's left? I mean, what can you do to understand what happened if that first that piece is gone, right? Which is, say, if you want to know how many people died, if you want to know what excess mortality is, if you want to know, some individual person's health records, right? These can all be gone, right? But then indirect death, more generally, we have a paper coming out soon that's a kind of survey of all the work that's been done on how indirect death is created in wartime. And in the case of Iraq in particular, right, the notion that you have to understand what happens when you destroy infrastructure. You have to understand what happens when you destroy a household income, a head of household whose income source is gone. What happens to the health and well-being of the society when those things happen? What are the reverberating effects? So an example would be, again, very, very clearly, that you destroy water and sewerage, you get diarrheal disease, you get death in children and adults. You destroy an electrical system, again, still not reconstructed in Iraq after all these years. What happens? People start to use generators. People start to go and live on the roof because the air conditioning is not available. People fall off the roof. People get electrocuted as they try and connect to their neighbor's generator. That's just a constant everyday process. That is a direct effect of the war, we can say. I mean, we call it, or the epidemiologists call it, indirect death, but I think we have to understand all of the ways in which the war continues to kill in these ways. So I would just add that, and again, in other war zones, depending on the context, a multiplication factor of 2 to 10 is used to account for the direct to indirect death ratio in Iraq. Again, no one knows where exactly, but you're now talking about millions of people who have died as a result of the war in the civilian sector. I think you have to also, again, the outmigration, you talked about the brain drain, but just the human drain, everybody running from this, for the initial violence, but also what you've just described, both of you, is this sense of the sort of ongoing flight from the indirect death, the death of a possibility, the foreclosed futures, right? To flee from that continues at a pace. One other thing I think is really important, and I don't know if anybody's done research yet on the militarization of Iraq. Obviously, you're already a militarized society, with, for many, many years. But again, partly through the 80s at the behest and support of the United States, funneling military support. But in both Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States funded a massive armaments and military or security labor in the country, and created, again, a much more militarized society, which has, again, the weapons transfers, the ongoing effect of that in many other contexts around the world where the U.S. has supposedly controlled events through proxy wars, through arms transfers, trying to control regional events. That always blows back boomerangs, right? So, and again, not necessarily right to the United States, but boomerangs into the society itself, right? Those arms are available for any number of actors, right? and I think, again, a lot of people don't recognize, and I'd love to hear you both talk more about the rise of militias and the way in which which many people say, well, good thing the United States was there already because, well, ISIS.
Yeah.
Wow, come on. I mean,
Yeah.
that level of
Yeah.
misinformation, disinformation, that has that not being understood. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I'm
Zainab, can I have a few points just like really to reiterate some of the points that Bridget and Kathy's made. So like when I lived in Iraq, like in the 80s, we had electricity 24/7. Like we never had electricity cuts. And then of course after the 1991, this is when the problem began to happen. Like we began to have power cuts a lot. And really the thing that, and I can't imagine what it's like now, because like sometimes like in the summer when it's 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're having a dust storms and there is no electricity for 3-4 days, you really feel like your soul, like this is when I really realized I have a soul and it's really getting torched and ripped apart. So what's happening now, dust storms are much more frequent. Like before we would have dust storms in July and August, like that's the peak. Now they are starting in April, continuing into October with no power, with high temperatures. So like again, like just the daily life, like is just like in terms of like really waking up, trying to go to school or to work, going about your daily life, like becomes such a struggle. One of the other things that I really wanted, like it's really interesting, and this is like one of the things we talked about in the last conference, and like some of the generals and the colonels there, like their heads were spinning, is that like people don't want refugees, especially like refugees from the Middle East. So I was telling them, like, if you don't want refugees, don't like destroy the environment, don't destroy the infrastructure, because that's what's happening. Like if people will leave, people will do anything. Like we've seen people crossing the Mediterranean. Desperate people will do anything, and like really the level of desperation is pushing people to do anything in order to leave. And of course, like then that's feed into the right wing and xenophobia politics in Europe and the United States. So like that's like again one impact of the war. And the last thing like I really wanted to mention in terms of Al-Qaeda and ISIS is like really we never had Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and that was like really an interesting issue like as far as Iraqis and Americans are concerned, because like one of the things that happened in 2003, I have my aunt's in-laws became part of the interim council, and one of the things he was telling the Americans is that protect the borders because fighters are coming in, Al-Qaeda is coming in, please protect the borders. And the Americans did nothing about that. And then now we have Al-Qaeda, and then that like evolved into ISIS. So it's just like really like the apocalypse, like really things just getting out of control. So just like these are some of like my thoughts, like I wanted to like reiterate.
Yes, and I'm glad you did. Thank you. I think that, I think that you brought us full circle to the xenophobia. We see that here, and that has these sort of long, circuitous roots. And I'm just thinking about Bridget's question with contracts and deregulation. And I guess my question to all of you would be, as we see ways to skirt around legal and political precedent, ways of keeping order, how can we conceive of this word accountability that is, I've seen in my research is a big one. How can we hold people accountable? So when we're seeing the level of destruction and distress and desperation, and I think that's an important word to keep in there, desperation, how can we hold accountable? How can we do reparations? What would reparations even look like? Any of you have thoughts on that?
Like, I think it's really like reparation is like since the United States hasn't like paid reparation to any country and hasn't
or here
exactly
yeah,
here, or like there is really this famous case in Ecuador like where Chevron contaminated the Amazons, and there was a court case, and it was at first in New York, and Chevron said no, we should, like, it's Ecuador, so they moved the case to Ecuador, and then the court ruled in favor of the indigenous people, and Chevron went after the American a lawyer and they haven't paid any reparations. So like it's really, I think it's really still, and like of course reparation if we think about slavery here or settler colonialism, and none of that has happened. Maybe things are happening in California a little bit. Now the Guardian came out about like the how slavery benefited the Guardian, and there is a call like for the royal family and British people to think about reparation. But I think really reparation is good to talk about, but I think it's not going to happen in the near future. And unfortunately, like I really would love, like once my partner and I bought the ticket when it was $1 billion, and Andrew asked me, what would you do if you get $1 billion? I'm like, I would take Bush and the Blair to the ICC. I would really have a whole set of lawyers, and do that. That would be if I have a $1 billion, because they really need to be held accountable. They know they can get away with it, and like really there is no mention of Bush or Cheney or Blair. So I think we should start like really thinking about reparation and talk about it and push for it. But like I don't see how that is possible, because this is not just a problem in Iraq. That's really a problem facing all marginalized and dispossessed communities all over the world.
Yeah, that's so well said, Zainab. I mean, I agree. I think reparations are critical. We need to talk about reparations. And for me, one very particular way we can do that is around oil flaring. So the government of Iraq has committed to ending oil flaring by 2030, but in the last 10 years, flaring has increased by 40%. So one thing that you can do, and that has been done recently in 2018, the government opened one recapture facility called the Basra Gas Company. The price tag was $1.5 billion. 1.5 billion. Okay, and there are 15 oil fields in Basra province alone. So the costs for actually responsible carbon capture are so astronomical. But that would be one space to hold the oil companies accountable. And, I was told by an oil consultant in the South, I mean, this is just like the preposterous nature of the business. This guy was hired to be the corporate social responsibility voice for all of these oil companies in southern Iraq. And so they give money to things that, CSR projects typically do, like building a museum and other sort of restoring the marshes in the southern part of the country, And so he was saying that the oil facilities, I'm not sure, I'm clear if these are the refineries or the drilling facilities, were built according to like standards in the industry. So they have the pipes for methane recapture in the plant, but they need to be hooked up to another facility that needs to be built to physically then recapture this methane. And one of the things that is unbelievable here is that actually recapturing the methane, you can use that as a power source. So it would, not only would it be helping to curb pollution, but it could be providing the country with a much needed power source for electricity, for example. And so this really needs to be done. And I think the oil companies need to be held accountable and build this infrastructure.
How many of those wells, how many of those facilities would be needed?
So in Basra, 15.
15?
And I don't know about the other provinces. We need to do a study on that, Catherine.
Okay. Well, that would be about 20-something billion. That is 0.01% of what it costs to wage the war. So, we always struggle with this, right? How to communicate, how ridiculous these fears of what the cost of a reparation or a simple amelioration like that. Which has a subtraction and then an addition back, as you said, to use the methane. But so we once had an infographic with a 3 for the 3 trillion that the war cost, and we had it pixelated. So let's say the 3. Okay, I really should have a chalkboard, but a 3 like this, and we had pixels, and you can just sort of say 3 trillion is not just a little bit more than 3 billion. It's and people just hear million, trillion, zillion. It makes no
Yes.
sense. It's a lot, right? That's not sufficient. So the pixel, there would be 1 pixel there that would represent the reparation for that. So the idea that it's unaffordable, it's not. It's unthinkable that we would take responsibility as a nation in the
Yeah.
United States. So that's, but the showing how, and including the idea of reconstruction, right? The United States, people will often point to the sort of beneficence of the reconstruction effort and how many billions were spent on reconstruction. That budget included the majority of the reconstruction dollars went to military labor,
Yes.
to prisons, to, that's not, okay.
Yeah, no, and 6 to 8 billion was just straight lost in cash. I mean,
Yep.
like there was the cash flights
Yeah.
going in and out of New York and Baghdad for a year. I mean, blocks, $100 blocks of cash, and it's just being handed out. I mean, so they have war money in some ways, but not in others. Yeah. So I would. How are we doing on time? Should we maybe open up to questions, or do we have some kind of engagement from the audience? Go ahead. Oh, we're gonna give you a mic. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no. Got it. Thank you.
Yes, somebody mentioned that the military in the United States is still held in extremely high accord. And your testimony would suggest that the war in Iraq has been a massive military failure, which has made Iraq even worse off than it was under Saddam Hussein, which would be a really amazing achievement in some respects. And its failure in Afghanistan is even more impressive. You even got pictures of the collapse in that case. Nonetheless, it still remains very high, as pointed out, in esteem. It can't be self-promotion, because if it were self-promotion, then everybody would be in love with politicians, and we know that's not happening. So why do people still regard it? There's also failures in Libya and in Syria, and quite a few other places, not to mention Vietnam in the olden days. So why does the military able to still have those high ratings? Any suggestions?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is, number one, they do an incredible amount of self-promotion. They have to recruit 800,000 new people to the military every year, and they have a huge budget to do that, which involves selling the military to young people and to their families. So the junior ROTC program, the flyovers at football games, the work it does with Pentagon does with Hollywood to make sure that the films that they produce are basically Pentagon propaganda. There's a huge swath of our cultural terrain that is a purchased ad for the military, suggesting it's where you go if you want to become a man and you want to become a good person and you want to rescue people it's a very, I think that's a really important factor. I think the other thing is that all of the civilians and this conference, there was a lot of discussion. I'd love to hear what you all think about how many minutes were spent of all the time there was to talk about the Iraq War on what do you do, a fellow veteran, when somebody says to you, thank you for your service, right? The discomfort that they felt and what. But civilians in the United States have struck a bargain with our military, our all-volunteer force, that they will serve so that we do not, that they will die so that our children will not. And we purchase that with borrowed money, right? So the anxiety and guilt and bargaining, the moral bargaining, I think, that happens between civilians and soldiers results in a way that it doesn't for politicians, results in their being kept on this pedestal. So I think there's a lot of complicated things going on, but that's at least the start of an answer.
Yeah, I'll just have 2 quick comments. So, not exactly like related immediately to the military, but like your comment really reminded me of the kind of sentiment among Iraqis now, that Iraqis are actually nostalgic for Saddam Hussein's day, and that really says a lot. That's like really the unthinkable happening. Like I did field work among Iraqis in London about like the question of identity and belonging, and I have some Iraqi connections in Iraq, and like even family members like who even families who have members who died under Saddam Hussein's regime or were imprisoned, they say Saddam Hussein's days are better because you only know that you had Saddam Hussein to deal and his regime to deal with. But now you don't know where the violence is coming from. The US military, the militias, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. So that's like really, like this is one of the like really kind of things I don't think American politicians or the military wants to really acknowledge, that the invasion was such a spectacular failure that made Iraqis nostalgic for Saddam Hussein's day. The other thing is related to Kathy's point about the military. Like during that conference we went to, it was really interesting. Some of the vets said, like when we joined because like we really thought we are like going on a moral campaign. We are going to help people. We are going to bring democracy. So some of them are really disappointed and angry about their experience. And they said, like one of them, like who was an organizer, like he said, like when he joined the military, he was in his 20s. Like if things happened now, he wouldn't do it. So it's like, again, it's interesting to see like the disenchantment among soldiers and vets, but the military, again, is an institution where you can get education, find a job, have healthcare. So, and like the propaganda from Hollywood and the media. So that would really be so hard to disentangle, I think.
Hello, thank you for your insight. So my question is about the Kurds. If there's an argument I mean, if the US invasion of Iraq benefited one group, the argument goes with the Kurds because Kurds were subject to, genocidal acts by Saddam, and after the US invasion with the new constitution in 2005, Kurds gained autonomy, to a certain extent, financial autonomy, political autonomy, and today it's considered one of the, quote unquote, safe havens in Iraq. So I wonder what your perspectives about this Arab Kurdish understanding of US invasion. I don't think Kurds, fondly remember Saddam today. So how did the US invasion affect these identity dynamics in Iraq? Thank you.
I'll take that, and if you want. So the question of Kurds is, of course, really important and interesting, and it really doesn't just like date back to the US invasion. It dates back to really World War I, when the British promised the Kurds a state, and then they renegated on that because like it didn't suit their geopolitical interests. So like the Kurds have always had a history of mobilizing and resistance, like national governments, whether in Iran, Iraq, Turkey, or Syria. But like also one thing to keep really in mind when it comes to Kurds is that how they really became pawns in international and geopolitical game. So for example, in the 70s, the United States supported the Kurds to rise up against the national government in Baghdad. And once Iraq and Iran reached an agreement in the 70s, the United States absolutely stopped supporting the Kurds, and then the regime massacred them. In 1988, when the chemical weapons were used against the Kurds, all these chemical weapons came from West Germany, European countries, and the United States. So when we really talk about the Kurds in Iraq, we really need to think of them not just only in terms of the boundaries of the nation state in Iraq, but also how regional and international powers use them in order to achieve like their own interest. So the interesting thing about the Kurds is that in 1991 they almost became semi-autonomous in Iraq. So, and they were not really impacted by the 2003 invasion because like the war didn't, the invasion didn't reach them, and it really actually Kurdistan became a safe havens for a lot of Iraqis who are escaping violence, as long as they can find sponsorship. Having said that, like really the Kurdish ruling elites are very corrupt. Like it's few elites are making tons of money. The majority of Kurds in Iraq are really like are not doing well. And I don't know if you remember, like before the war in Ukraine, there was this standoff between Poland and Belarus, and they were talking about Iraqi refugees being caught up there, like they were kind of Belarus was and Russia were trying to mess with Europe, so they told them, okay, they told Iraqi refugees, you can come and then you can cross to Europe, and then they got stuck in Belarus, and actually the great majority of them were Kurds. They were not like people from South Iraq or Central Iraq, because the living situations is really bad. So if you are affiliated with one of the parties, then you are doing great. And again, like Kurdistan is being now celebrated as like this new haven in Iraq, but it's like really a neoliberal paradise. So it's like, so that's the whole thing. So even when we talk about Kurds, we have really to think about class and power, and how that's impacting them, and like how really I think a lot of like Kurdish individuals, like they really, it's like the question is like their blight in terms of like really inability to find jobs, or their struggle with neoliberal reforms and privatizations. Their struggles are not heard just because they are assumed, oh, Kurdistan is a safe haven, and like really no one is talking about that.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I started going to Kurdistan in 2007. I made several trips during that time there to participate in stakeholder meetings on the Marshlands Conservation Project. And so I was there during the surge. And, you know, one of the things that Kurdistan did was leverage its security to invite capitalism, to invite capitalist enterprise. And so, you know, the effects have been extreme. This is exactly what you're talking about, Zaynab. In 2007, when I started going to Sulaymaniyah, you know, it was a roundabout with roads spiking out from it, and it was very dusty. There was one luxury hotel that was sort of falling apart, and I went back. I think it was 2017, and you know the effect. I mean, God, in less than 10 years, Sulaymaniyah was completely transformed. So the second time I went to go to a conference, and they put us up at this hotel. I mean, this is just spectacular, called the Titanic, okay? Because a Russian oligarch, I mean, this is what, when Zaynab says neoliberal capitalism is alive, this is what she's talking about. Russian oligarch decided that his dream was to have a hotel in the shape of the Titanic, and so he opened one in Sulaymaniyah, where in the evenings on the weekends, a singer, during the week, a jazz singer would croon, you know, and people would come and it would be sway. And in the weekends, it would turn into like the hottest club in Sulaymaniyah. And, you know, there were hotel rooms on the upper floors, and the whole first floor were Russian oil company offices. One of our colleagues, Kali Rubai, writes about Cement Valley in Kurdistan, and the fact that the kind of extraction of resources for the cement industry is going to basically flatten the hills of Kurdistan soon. During this trip that I was there in 2017, I met with Iraqi exiles who came back, and this reminds me of the talk that we've been having about your relatives, right? Who came back from like London and were basically taking advantage of the minimal regulations on private investment in order to build their own industries. And what were they doing? They were in the construction, in the cement business, working for Lafarge, I mean, Lafarge has been in the news because of the corruption. They were in cahoots with Al Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. So, and you know, just the unfathomability of corruption in Kurdistan and the ways that people, you know, are living in that is it's just so extreme. And so, you know, I think, thank you for your question, because I think that you're absolutely right. Like, this is not something people really talk about.
Yeah, and it's really the other interesting thing when the 2019 uprising happened in Iraq, like by really young people raising the slogan, "We want a homeland." There was a lot of support from people in Kurdistan. Like, there were demonstrations in Kurdistan in solidarity with people, with Iraqis in the south, because they really saw that they are Iraqis, like whatever, or Kurds or Kurds of Iraq, who are really struggling with the same kind of corrupt political institution. So that's the thing. So yes, so it's unfortunate again, like how really. Like unbridled capitalism is just like all about making money and just leaving the majority of people struggling daily.
Thanks. Hello? Okay. Hi, I'm a geographer. Several of you have expressed frustration at the media's unwillingness to engage with some of these issues, and as someone who studies the environmental impacts of the drug war, particularly in Central America, one of the more chilling things I discovered when engaging with the media was that there was very little interest in the human costs of the drug war in Central America, but, and I quote, when Elizabeth Malkin from the New York Times covered some of our work, she said, "This is great." And I said, well, why does this seem so interesting to you? And she said, well, we always hear about the drug war's impact on people, but you know, that doesn't really, but the forest is always innocent. And so you saying that the war is impacting the environment is really great, and it's really going to get readers. So I'm asking, are you finding that the focus on environmental devastation is perhaps drawing new audiences to the cost of war?
Thank you for this question, because it's a multi-layered question. I mean, first let me say, like, I knew a number of journalists who were reporting the story in Iraq and really sought to do as much as they could under the parameters that they were given. But the way that the media has worked to highlight the marshes in particular has been very problematic. This is a story that gets talked about as, like, you know, the marshes are where Sumerian civilization originated. But that area is often talked about as like the Garden of Eden. And so I've traced now, I did a media sort of archival project. This story has been reported out like 1,200 times. That an Iraqi exile affiliated with the U.S. government with U.S. money, seed money, went in to restore the marshes of Iraq and remake the Garden of Eden. And many of these, like, this is NPR, the BBC, the Guardian, the New York Times. I mean, these are all the sources that I go to when I'm looking to, you know, get information about a story. So the respected sources. And they always talk about this area, the marshes, as if it's unchanged for 5,000 years, which is like completely ahistorical. I mean, we know this, like, this isn't gonna fly. But the way that Eden narrative was circulated politically by the Bush administration to pivot away from a war against weapons of mass destruction and toward a preemptive humanitarian war was very effective. And so the media coverage of the marshes restoration project after 2003, because of course Saddam Hussein had drained the marshes after an uprising encouraged by President George H. Bush, nearly deposed him in the early 90s. And now in 2003, we have President George W. Bush invading Iraq and harnessing this narrative of, this is a preemptive war, this is a humanitarian war, we're going to restore the marshes, we're going to restore the Garden of Eden, and that was reported out. And what that covers over, God, yes, there are real environmental problems in Iraq, but that particular angle of reporting covers over the fact that the exile who was pursuing this project has been convicted in Italy of embezzling $3.5 million of the $54 million he got from the government of Italy in cahoots with the Italian Minister of Environment and Territory. He was convicted of this in an Italian court. This is never mentioned. And in Iraq, he has been charged with corruption from the Iraqi High Tribunal also. And when you go to the marshes now, where's the $54 million? It's not in Iraq. It's, evaporated. Because, as you know, 80% of these funds went back to Italy, first of all. So I want to be careful about when we say, has environmental coverage, focused a light on Iraq in a meaningful way. And I think the example that you provide, the forest is innocent. Yeah, that is really problematic categorization of what's happening on the ground. The environment can so easily be used, in fact, as a weapon to facilitate all kinds of money laundering, corporate extraction. And this is what I try to do in my work, is to shine a light on that.
Yeah, and I want just to add one quick comment, also how kind of the idealization of the marshes and the romanticization of the marshes has also impacted really kind of the politics of identity, because after 2003 you began to hear a lot of Iraqis oh, we are not Iraqis, we are not Arabs, we are Mesopotamians, we are Sumerians. The joke used to be in Iraq, it's only Lebanese people who think of themselves as ancient Egyptians, or some ancient Phoenicians, or some Egyptians think of them as ancient Egyptians, but Iraqis never had this sense of oh, we are so special, we are Sumerians. But then you began to have kind of this reconstruction of memory among people who identified as Iraqis and Arabs before 2003, and now there is a kind of reimagination. Oh no, and that it's really pernicious, because the whole assumption becomes is that we are the true Mesopotamians, we are the true Sumerians, and then the Arabs were invaders, and that's happened 14 centuries ago. And I'm are we so it's becoming India, or so we are okay, are we going into this politics now? So it's really interesting how these discourses about the environment can really have impact on self-construction and politics to a great extent.
If I could ask a complimentary question, thank you for a powerful panel. I'm interested in how not the media, but decision makers have been able or not been able to hear anthropological knowledge. And what strikes me as the huge exemplary innovation of the Costs of War project is that you have taken all of this ethnographic observation, everything that normally comes out in certain, localized narrative sorts of channels, and you've translated it into the quantitative metrics that policymakers recognize as knowledge. And so, and economists, of course, have a way of conceptualizing what you're doing as pricing in the externalities. of the way that the actions are framed by the doers. So I wanted to ask about that reception, whether the project has made itself heard in the places that you hoped for. And I heard you speak of the danger that it simply gets recuperated into a lessons learned narrative. You know, we'll take that factor into account. We won't make this mistake again. But do you feel that the project has become a referent in at least some of the policy and planning milieus in State Department or DOD or among other relevant actors?
Zero in DOD. I mean, that's not, I wasn't suggesting that we've had any impact there. It's mainly in the public policy sphere and in the public. But our reports are qualitative. They're not, we often have a number that's associated with in any of the reports, but the reports are often very qualitative, very much based in on accounts of everyday life and everyday impacts of the war. But what the media picks up and what they want is a number, right? So, and we know that, but we also know, and it's unfortunate that the number, and we keep track of all, the Brown keeps track of all the media hits, and they will take our budgetary number before they'll take our human death toll. And we struggle with that. We try to foreground it whenever we do a report. We try to point it out to journalists before we even start the conversation, right? I don't know what your story frame is going to be, but we think this is the most important thing, and can you highlight that? But no, I think the uptake has been really good from progressive and some libertarian Congress people. Our numbers have been held up. Some people put them on charts or put up our map or whatever to contest things like the AUMF continued life, and President Biden, when he withdrew from Afghanistan, he cited us for the financial costs. So we'll take whatever we can get. But it is very telling what people pay attention to, including, I think some of the thing we struggle with is to figure out what is the question to which our reports can be answers. What are the questions that the American public has or the policymakers have that will make sense to people, right? So again, some of the questions we've gotten here are more sophisticated, but if you look at all the questions you get and the questions we got in Georgia, I think we have to keep going back to those questions and saying, no, why did somebody ask me, but how many people, in your numbers, he said snidely, in your numbers of human deaths, do you have another number for how many people would have died at the hands of Saddam Hussein had we not invaded?
Right. Yeah.
Right. So then you say, okay, what's the frame that he and many people are using that we have to contest and or address directly, right? So I think the questions from the public, the attention where it is and where it isn't, which of our reports have gotten an uptake and which of our reports haven't. We're actually meeting next week to try and sort some of that out.
If I may take the prerogative to just ask you a little bit about how the Cost of War project and that approach has evolved over time. You were mentioning the other day about how it started in 2010 with sort of, no one really knew what it was, and so how has that what kinds of questions have you been able to answer about the war, do you think?
Well, how's it evolved? I think initially we always began with the idea that the main lever of change that we were working with was American public opinion, and so we had to, people think Americans think wars are cheap. Americans think, with the help of Pentagon propaganda, think that they're going to be quick and easy, right? The estimates of the cost of the Iraq War at the beginning, coming out of the Bush administration, were ridiculous, right? So we started with that, and then it evolved in the sense that we increasingly had we began knowing that we wanted to speak to the public and have infographics, have everyday language, not academic language. That was, we gradually began to understand more and more about how journalists worked, and that nobody was actually going to, very few of them were going to have the time, weren't going to go into the report. They were going to, at best, go to the press release and then ask us to tell them what the paper was about. So knowing that, we worked much harder on our press releases to make sure that they had exactly what we wanted to be said. And then we started to work in Washington. We started to go and do press conferences in the Capitol. It got invited by a variety of different people, usually the progressives, Barbara Lee or Progressive Caucus, and then increasingly meeting one-on-one with the foreign policy staff member of the representative who had some reputation as being interested in the Pentagon budget or the war. And sometimes that had really very immediate positive effects in terms of their using it in floor testimony or committee work, and or even legislation. John Lewis had a Costs of War Act that he put forward for several years in a row. And yeah, so we've stepped back from that a little bit since the virus, just because we didn't go to Washington. But we're thinking more and more about doing more research on the American audience and what exactly we need to be addressing.
Yeah.
Sorry. My question involves, and I may be a little bit of a skunk at the garden party in asking this, in the kind of what comes before and what comes after. And I think an honest accounting of the costs of the war has to also be thoughtful about what existed in Iraq pre-2003 and what has occurred post the departure of U.S. forces, recognizing that there's an enduring legacy that has been left there. And I want to ask you guys to comment on this in a broad way, but I'll lay out a few just thoughts of mine in reaction to some of what I've heard from all you guys, and with respect. I mean, Saddam was a brutal dictator. I was in Iraq in 2002. I've been to Abu Ghraib prison prior to the arrival of U.S. forces. And I think there's a danger in the romanticization and nostalgia for Saddam. Now, there were things that worked under Saddam's rule, particularly in the early part of the 80s before the full extent of the Iran war, and then obviously what happened after 91. So an honest accounting of his rule has to acknowledge that there were under the Ba'athist government things that should we say delivered for Iraqi people, certainly delivered disproportionately for the Sunni Arab population versus the Shia Arab population and the ethnic Kurdish population. But he was we don't need to go down the path of recounting the horrors of his rule. I'm not saying that to justify a U.S. decision to invade, but how can we have a discussion about the impacts of what was unleashed in 2003 while also being truthful about that? And I say this with respect, Bridget. I mean, the Shia uprising, you laid it on the hands of George W. Bush, but Saddam was brutally repressing the Shia population, and they were rising up to defend their community. And should the U.S. have done more to help them at that time? Perhaps, but it wasn't. And so Saddam's decision to drain the marshes, I would not put at the hands of George W. Bush. And then I would like to ask again, what comes after? And we talk about I honestly believe there are many Iraqis, I agree with you, Zainab, who want a more secular democracy.
Oh,
they don't want. And what is the chokehold? And we lay some of the blame on foolish decisions made by the U.S. occupation authorities in 2003 in embracing sectarian leaders and trying to view Iraq through a sectarian and ethnic prism. But when you look to today, the principal actor in that country is not the United States, it's Iran. And Tehran's influence and its support for sectarian leaders is what is pushing back fundamentally against the desires of many Iraqis for a more secular government. So I guess the broader question is, how do we have this conversation in a way that also takes into account the destruction to the infrastructure and destruction of society that occurred pre-2003 under the Saddam government, and the current malign influence of, for instance, Tehran in assessing what has been the consequence based on the U.S. invasion in 2003?
I'll take this one a little bit. So this is like what my book, Return to Ruin, is about, actually. And like one of the arguments in the book is like when we want to understand Iraq, we have to really look at the kind of entanglement between like national politics and like imperial politics, and like how the two fed into each other. So one thing about like the question, my immediate family member, my parents and sister died in Iraq because of Saddam Hussein's regime. And the reason for that, because my parents were communists. So, and they refused, they didn't want to leave Iraq because they always thought, they lived under the monarchy, and they thought the government will collapse at any second. There is no way Saddam Hussein could stay in power after all the atrocities he was committing against the communists, against the Shia, against the Kurds, the deportation of Iraqis of Iranian origin, the invasion of Iran. So they really believe that there is no way in hell he can stay in power with all these atrocities. But like the US, of course, had supported him in the 80s because like Iran was like an Islamic state, and Iraq really has a secular leaning, so this is one thing. And so I'm not saying that sectarianism didn't exist under Saddam Hussein. Like Saddam Hussein were scared of the Shia and the Kurds because they were a political challenge to him, not because they were Shia, not because of religious differences or ethnic differences. That was so my father's sisters, my father didn't talk to his sisters because they were part of the intelligence agency, and he was a communist. So and they were Shia. So that's the thing. Like the Shia who were really loyal to Saddam Hussein benefited drastically. The opposition among the Shia, especially the Da'wah party, who had affiliations with Iran, and of course the history of Iraq is really complicated in as far as Iran is regarded because of the like holy cities and like the madrasas. So that was the thing. Like Saddam definitely and that's what like one of the things like Iraqis told me about, and like the nostalgia for Saddam Hussein is that the only time when Saddam Hussein was really equal was in terms of his oppression, is that he went after anybody who was against him. So for example, my father had a friend who was from the Tikriti tribe. He was Saddam Hussein's cousin, but he was against Saddam Hussein, so he was imprisoned. So like that's the thing. But like then with the geopolitical situation and Iran like constituting a threat to Iraq, and then suppressing all opposition parties in Iraq by the late 70s, like the liquidation of the Iraqi Communist Party. So the Shia parties went underground in Iraq, and they kind of became the main challenge to Saddam Hussein's rule. So it's really, the whole question is like when we think about politics, it's always messy and complicated, and like identities can shift and have different meanings. And it's really like one of the ironic things is that first, that the United States didn't topple Saddam Hussein in 1991 because they were scared that there would be an Islamist government, and now we have really Iran ruling Iraq. So, like, honestly, the anti-Iranian sentiments among Iraqis is a little bit scary right now. Iraqis now are really happy there are sanctions on Iran, even though the sanctions are really harming civilians. So instead of like really having solidarity, they became the enemy because of Iran's influence in Iraq. Like, it's completely understandable. So the situation is extremely messy, but when you are trying to understand Iraq, is like, yes, I'm not saying Saddam Hussein like was great, but like his power, like he was supported by the U.S. for a long time. In the 90s, he was kept in power because during the sanctions because like he was a better option. But that was really unfair for Iraqis because then they had to live under a dictatorship. They had to live under the sanctions. And then when Saddam Hussein was removed, like it's really like, it's such an irony, like that Saddam Hussein is now, like Iraqis are now nostalgic for Saddam Hussein. And that really says something. Because like when I lived in Iraq, everybody hated Saddam, even people who worked for him, like people who were in the Ba'ath Party, because a lot of times people were co-opted. So for example, our neighbors were Iraqis of Iranian origin, which means that they held the Persian nationality under the Ottoman Empire, but they identified as Arabs. So they were deported to they were put on the borders in 1980, but then they were told you can come back to your life if you become part of the Ba'ath regime and you report on your neighbors. So that's how Saddam ruled. And so this is why like even like the neighbor, like everybody knew, that was public knowledge, that she became part of the Ba'ath Party, and we have to censor ourselves. We kept our friendship, but like with no discussion of politics. So it's like things are not like really black and white. Saddam was sectarian and oppressed Shia. Like he oppressed the Shia not because of sectarianism, because they were really a political challenge to him. And the same with the Kurds or with the communists. So like when really we talk about Iraq, we really have to keep that kind of the views of like really national politics, but like also how imperial and geopolitical interest impacted the situation, and also like how people had sometimes to make a bargain with the regimes or like leave. And that's really when the first massive waves began to come out of Iraqis in the 70s, escaping Saddam Hussein's regime, and then the 1991 uprising. So I think I'm rambling, but there is, yes, your question is very provocative, and there is, and this is why I wrote a book about that, because it's very complicated, and just like to bring everything into the picture.
Thanks, Rajiv, for the question about the marshes. I mean, certainly, there's no question that Saddam Hussein was brutally repressing Shia in the South. And I'm not arguing that, this would give the former president way too much power, that the uprising happened because of him. It did not. No. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying, and this is really, like, the nuance of this is really important, is that, as a strategy, because we were not going to go to Baghdad to forcibly remove Saddam Hussein from office, President George H.W. Bush leafleted the South and went on Voice of America, encouraging people to rise up, right? And so people did rise up, and I did a number of interviews in London. Somehow we missed each other in London. Yeah. With Iraqi exiles who participated in that uprising. And what they remember is, on the days of the uprising, they saw U.S. military planes up above, some of them making like peace signs in the sky with their exhaust, right? And encouraging the uprising. But then as soon as Saddam Hussein came with the Air Force and used air power to forcibly subdue the uprising, like brutally murdering participants in that uprising, the U.S. did not defend them. They immediately withdrew, and people remember that betrayal. And then still, people who had participated in the revolution chose to once again align with the U.S. in 2003 to help the invasion, to overthrow Saddam Hussein once again, and again were betrayed by the U.S. military intervention and occupation of Iraq. And so, this kind of resentment that is building from people who were our allies because of how we behaved twice, and then the whole period of sanctions in between, where we're continually bombing and starving the population of Iraq. I mean, this is an important history, and we wonder why there are militias rising in Iraq now. I mean, yes, Iran is dominant, but part of this is our own making here. What kinds of opportunities exist for people for employment? These are new set of economic factors that were introduced by the U.S. government, and so I just I want to. One other thing about the marshes. This is like maybe too much of a deep dive on the marshes, but I find this really fascinating.
Flag time for you really quick. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
30 seconds.
Okay.
Saddam Hussein also in the 70s went into the marshes and brought a boat to bring reed harvest to the market, brought another boat that was to deliver healthcare to the marshes. You know, so when Zainab says this is a complicated history, it is a complicated history. You know, there are both the cultivation of loyalty and then brutal repression at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to have to cut us off now to take a brief caffeination break, but I wanted to just thank again our wonderful panelists for your insights and
Thank you.
thank you so much. So we will take a quick break now. We'll come back at 11:30 with our second panel on historical context. So yeah, let's get coffee. Great. Thank you.